we're going to continue talking about conformity and obedience, and then we'll move on to social roles and how power dynamics can affect behavior. But we're starting off with this idea of groupthink, which is an idea of conformity but taken to a pretty big extreme. So when you have a group that's responsible for making decisions, if it's a really important decision, then you'd really, really hope that they'd be making an educated and informed decision. And anyone passively sort of deferring to the opinions of the group can end up being disastrous. But we've found that even when making trivial decisions, such as judging line lengths, there's quite a bunch of people who end up conforming to the incorrect responses that are given by a group. So they'll basically give in to that group pressure to say what everyone else is saying. So in some groups, the need for this conformity and agreeing to that group decision ends up being really strongly encouraged. And anybody with different ideas or anything that differs from what the group has put forth is ended up being discouraged or excluded from that decision-making process. And so this setup is described as groupthink. And so this was first described by a social psychologist named Irving Janis in the 1970s. But there were a couple of qualities that contributed to poor decision making as a group. The first of these is that people tend to overestimate the group. We have this illusion of invulnerability, so a belief that the group is generally good. There's this inherent morality where this is a good group of people. I have very good classmates. We're going to make the right choice. And so even though that might not be the case, we have this illusion or this perception of that being the case. We also end up with closed-mindedness, which is this collective rationalization and this stereotype views of things different than what's been agreed on. So any divergent thinking ends up being discouraged, and you need to sort of stick with that group thought process. So don't think of anything else, only think of what you've already heard, what's already been presented, and what we've already agreed on. And then there's also pressure for uniformity. So you might have direct pressure on people who dissent, or people who sort of don't agree with that idea. You might have self-censorship, where someone doesn't want to speak up and go against the group. There might be illusions of unanimous agreement. So if somebody thinks that everyone else is quiet, so they must agree with this, I'll stay quiet too, even though I don't agree. But if they're all thinking that, then they don't realize that all of them don't agree. And then there can also be self-appointed mind guards. These would be people who basically set themselves up as the person who prevents others from challenging the leader's ideas. And so all of these pressures for uniformity can get people to stick to the group idea. Nobody speaks up, nobody says anything, even if they think that the group is going in the wrong direction. And this has had some pretty disastrous results in history. So there are documented cases of groupthink causing problems with Pearl Harbor and even the Challenger space shuttle explosion, where there were individuals who knew that something was happening or knew that something was wrong and maybe wanted to do something about it. But we saw this overestimating the group. So if we look at the Pearl Harbor example, overestimating the group would be, oh, no one can hurt the US Navy. We're invulnerable. Everything will be fine. Closed-mindedness was, well, nobody else has said anything. If I speak out, I'm silenced. My superiors tell me not to say anything. I'm just going to sort of stick with doing my job and nothing else. I won't go outside of my area. And then that pressure for uniformity would be, if somebody speaks out, they'd be told off. Maybe you don't want to speak out against, say, people of higher rank, self-censorship with that internalized rank. And then seeing that nobody else was saying anything, maybe you assume that everyone is okay with it. And then it ended up with some pretty disastrous results in these situations. So this is a pretty troublesome situation to run into. And we can actually have this diagram from the textbook that gives us a little bit more in-depth explanation of some of these ideas. So that illusion of invulnerability, talking about excessive optimism that ends up increasing our risk-taking. So the thoughts that nothing could possibly go wrong, and so on and so forth. So I touched on most of these, but this is the full version if you wanted to read through them. So our next section, we're going to start talking about social roles, the bystander effect, and then we're going to take a little bit of a left turn and talk about religious cults. But within our lives, we typically have quite a few social roles. We have different expectations placed on us based on our social roles. So as an undergraduate student, that might make you have some assumptions of how you should behave, expectations for who you are and how you are. And those roles might vary across courses. So an art student versus a science student versus whatever, between different colleges. Is it a big school or a small school, or even in different countries? So there are going to be lots of different roles that vary in different situations, but all of these roles end up sort of dictating our behaviors because we want to conform to those expectations. And so we're going to talk about some extremes of social roles, and specifically some of the biggest examples that you always see in psychology, starting off with the Stanford prison experiment. So if you haven't heard of the Stanford prison experiment before, then we're going to go over the brief history of it here. But this starts with researcher Philip Zimbardo, who was working at Stanford University in the 1970s, and he decided that he wanted to research social roles and how people took on roles when they were assigned to them. So he selected 24 young men as participants. They were evaluated, all of them as sort of mentally and physically healthy, and then they were randomly assigned to be either a prisoner or a guard. And so Zimbardo ended up recruiting the local police to help him sort of gather the designated prisoners. They were placed under arrest in their homes. And the prisoners, though they knew they were participating in the study, they didn't know that this was all going to be going on. So they were arrested and handcuffed and placed in the back of a police car. And it was meant to give them sort of the experience of being a prisoner. And so, although the police ended up following the same protocol as normal, they also ended up placing a bag over the prisoner's head so that they weren't aware that they were being taken to campus to do this study. So, for those who have discussed ethics previously, this should be raising some red flags, but this is in fact one of those experiments that ended up pushing us to establish more solid ethical rules and guidelines going forward. So at the time, while this was ethically questionable, I'm not certain that it was completely against the rules. This experiment was supposed to go on for 14 days. So they were going to get these prisoners to behave as prisoners, to take on the role as prisoners for a full 2 weeks. That was the duration of the experiment. But they ended up having to end this experiment after only 6 days. So really, really early on, things went too far and had to be sort of removed or shut down. So we talked about the prisoners, but what about the guards? The guards were also provided with things to help them take on that role. So they were given attire and items that were designated to make them feel like guards. So they got khaki pants, they got sort of military supply store shirts, reflective sunglasses, and a wooden club. So things that would make them feel powerful, but also separate and different from the prisoners. And so in this instance, we're starting to see a little bit of de-individualization, where the guards were taking on the role of guards, so they weren't necessarily seeing themselves as their own individual self. And the prisoners, who were given sort of these prison uniforms that you can see here, they were referred to only as their prison number. That was starting to remove their feeling of self and individual identity as well. So those are some important factors that helped set up them dropping into these roles or putting on these assigned roles. And they settled in fairly quickly. The prisoners started to feel powerless, dehumanized, and depersonalized, and the guards, in addition to just sort of getting them to refer to themselves with their numbers, they also used tactics that made them feel like they were no longer an individual. They depersonalized those prisoners. And they even found that this was so effective that they had prisoners dropping out of the study almost daily. The first person dropped out within the first day, and they had to be replaced by standby individuals who had signed up for the experiment. And interestingly, Zimbardo ended up actually taking on a role himself in this. He ended up being the sort of prison superintendent. He was the one in charge. And acting in this role, he was fairly proud of what he was accomplishing. He was looking at what was going on, where the prisoners were powerless and sort of in a really sad state, and the guards were depersonalizing them and sort of making them feel awful, and they were taking on this powerful, self-important role. And so Zimbardo was actually quite pleased that he was seeing such an intense response. He was seeing great role taking on, and he was pretty happy with it. But when he ended up showing one of his graduate students exactly what was going on and how excited he was at what was happening, the grad student was horrified that the experiment was still running, because it was apparent that the participants were suffering, and nobody had stepped in to stop the experiment. So as the superintendent, Zimbardo ended up lost in his own role and lost sight of all of those ethical red flags that were probably sort of flying up in your brains at this point. So, as I said, this is one of those very famous psychological studies that helps us understand how sort of good people can end up doing horrible things when put in the appropriate situation. And if you end up watching, there's some really good documentaries on the Stanford prison experiment, especially, I think there's a few from the BBC that looked at sort of the after effects of this prison experiment. And some of the people who served as guards ended up having a lot of trauma after this, because when they went back to their normal life, they were faced with sort of the horror at what they had done while taking on that role. And so it ended up causing a lot of distress to those people who had participated, whether they were prisoners or guards, which is something to consider. So an interesting extreme about the idea of taking on a role and how we might change a lot of our behavior in extreme ways that we might not have predicted in order to fill in that role. Our next thing that we want to talk about in terms of group behavior is the bystander effect. And this effect was made famous, mostly it's talked about from the murder of Kitty Genovese. Never say words right. And so she was murdered in the 1960s, and this was a really long attack, and it wasn't something that was quiet. It wasn't that nobody had noticed it. This was something that happened over the course of 30 minutes. It was violent, it was loud. The attacker left and came back to finish what he was doing. There were 38 alleged witnesses who said that they had heard the occurrence that was going on, but nobody actually called the police. They weren't called until it was much, much too late. And so this bystander effect was proposed to try and make sense of the fact that all of these people had heard, and all of these people could have intervened, but none of them did. So our bystander effect is the idea that a person in need is far less likely to receive help as the number of people who are present increases. So as there are more and more bystanders around, as there are more people in the area, the likelihood of you actually receiving help from any of those people goes down. Now, before we get too much into this conversation about the bystander effect, it's probably important to note that a lot of the facts that were put forward about the case originally have actually been disproven in recent years. So the original story and the thing that drove most of those original studies, that no one helped and it was this big thing where everyone stood around and did nothing, it ended up not being quite that extreme. There were quite a few discrepancies and things that were reported wrong and things like that. So there are some factors that have been challenged and disproven in the last little while, but it did do an important thing, because whether it was correct or not, the announcement of that event and the understanding of how that event might have happened ended up starting this new breed of psychology, or sort of a new line of inquest, where people wanted to understand what might have led to this happening. And so the general idea here is that there's a diffusion of responsibility. So as the number of people who are present increases, the relative level of accountability for each person decreases. So if you think of the idea that there's only one person present, you are the only person, so you have 100% of the responsibility. You have to help, or there's no one else who will. But if there's two people present, well, now you're equally responsible. So you each have, say, 50% of the responsibility. And if there's 3 people or 4 people or more, we start seeing that diffusion or reduction of your individual responsibility, and you start having more of an assumption that someone else will do it because there are so many other people who could do it. So no one person ends up being held accountable, and so no one ends up doing anything. So this is really apparent, especially if you've ever been trained for, say, first aid or CPR. One of the steps of your training is that if you've encountered a situation where someone needs help, that you need to do something, you take charge, and you need to point at an individual in the crowd, point directly to them, use some kind of identifying feature so that they know that you're talking about them and to them, and give them specific directions. So as a helper, if you had simply shouted, "Someone call 911," then nobody knows who's going to do it. If there's 20 people around, they're like, well, 911 doesn't need 20 different phone calls. Someone else will do it. But if everyone has said that and no one has called, then nothing has happened. That responsibility was diffused. So instead, what you should do is point at someone and say, "Hey, you in the red sweatshirt, you need to call 911. Then you can get rid of that diffusion of responsibility. You've given all of that responsibility to that one individual. So you can sort of get around some of this by making certain actions and sort of individualizing each person that you want to do particular things. Another important factor is pluralistic ignorance. And this is when people end up failing to act because they're relying on social cues from others in order to decide on how to behave. And they might do this without realizing that the people that they're using as a guide, the ones that they're referencing, they might also be uncertain. So it's kind of that idea of if you're sitting in a room with a bunch of people and something falls in the hallway outside, you don't quite know what to do. So you look around at everyone else in the room. If nobody else has moved, you assume that, okay, well, it must be nothing. I'm not going anywhere. But what if everyone else is sitting there doing the same thing? What if they're watching for someone else to move? So we have this pluralistic ignorance where you're all looking to each other for guidance on how to behave, but none of you know what to do. And so no one acts because they're not sure what they should be doing. So we can fail to act because we're relying on these faulty social cues, not realizing that everyone else is unsure of themselves as well. And so from all of the hundreds of thousands of different studies that have been done on the bystander effect, there are some factors that people generally agree that end up affecting whether you help someone or not. There's a big factor of environment. So if you're in an urban setting versus a rural setting, you're a lot more likely to be helped in a rural setting. And that's simply because when you're in a smaller setting, when everyone knows everyone, when you're interacting with people, it's more likely that you're going to know them. Whereas there's that sort of unknowingness of being in an urban environment. If you're surrounded by more people and you don't know any of them, you're going to be a lot less likely to help. There's also something called a sense of common fate. And this is the idea of if you're all in the same situation, or if you're all going somewhere together or doing something together, then you're going to end up being a lot more likely to help. So a bunch of famous studies have looked at how people behave when they're in, say, a subway car. So everyone is on the same car, they're going to the same place, they're in the same room doing the same thing. So this sense of common fate means that they're going to be a little bit more likely to help others than we might otherwise predict. Whereas if you were just walking down the street and someone collapsed on the side of the road, you wouldn't necessarily have that sense of commonality because you're not necessarily doing the same thing or walking the same way or anything like that. We also need to consider some other factors like, do you actually perceive if help is needed? Is this something that requires help, or is this something that you shouldn't get involved in? So is it that somebody has slipped and fallen and needs a hand up, or is it that someone has tripped and they're standing up on their own? And so our judgment of whether or not someone needs our help can lead us to either help or not help. Another thing to consider is the risk to self. And this is an interesting one because it ends up almost contradicting the perception of help required. So if you look at someone and they're bleeding, so they're injured so badly that they're bleeding, you would think that you're perceiving them as needing a lot of help. So you should expect to see a lot more helping. But in fact, we see a lot less helping if there's blood present, or sort of anything that's sort of gross or messy or anything like that. And we seem to think that that's because there's a risk to the self. So blood and vomit and all of those bodily fluids could be dangerous to you as a helper. So you might be less likely to go and help because you don't want to put yourself at risk. And then, of course, in psychology, there's also personal factors. So maybe you're in a hurry, maybe you don't know how to help, or maybe you're physically unable to help. All of those will affect whether you stop to help someone or not. And then our next couple of slides, we're going to touch on religious cults. And so this is sort of a random topic to pop up here, but it does tie into that idea of behavior as a group that we've been following through so far. So when we're looking at religious cults, they're typically a religious group that's outside of the mainstream religion. So it's someone outside of what we typically accept and view as a religion. And there are a couple of common traits that can help us identify these cults. So cults are typically built around a charismatic leader. We'll usually see the members of the group using something called love bombing. So the existing followers end up luring in new recruits, and they are very affectionate, and they give them lots of attention and pay lots of interest to them. And it ends up having these new recruits feeling really loved and welcomed and comfortable. So this is sort of a warm and comforting and welcoming environment that they're happy to be in. And then it leads into the next step where they end up starting to realize that they're actually isolated from anyone outside of this group. They only have experience with those who are part of the cult. So they might not realize that while they're being showered with this affection, they're also being isolated and surrounded only by others affiliated with this cult. And there are several commonalities among people who tend to join cults. They seem to be a little bit more appealing to people who are disenfranchised, so people who aren't doing well in their everyday life, people who aren't fitting in with society, who don't have a place where they feel like they belong. People who are young also tend to do well with cults, or who are lonely, who don't have lots of social bonds. Also, people who are uneducated and gullible tend to be a lot easier to draw in using these methods. But we're actually going to look at two of those big names in religious cults. We're going to look at the People's Temple, which was run by Jim Jones. So again, we see this charismatic leader that set everything up. We ended up with isolation and fear. And in this cult, they actually took it to an extreme because this cult ended up relocating to a new country so that people were separated from where they were. They were isolated in this new place. Their passports were taken away, and they were surrounded only by other members of the cult. And so the leader, Jim Jones, ended up having both psychological and physical control. So there was the threat of violence if you left, but there was also sort of this psychological setup where people were separated from their families. They didn't know who to trust, and they just sort of didn't speak out or didn't go anywhere and didn't do anything because they didn't know how or who they could talk to or where they could go and all of this. So over time, they had an environment where everyone was feeling helpless and fearful, and they wouldn't act out for fear of having someone report them and for being punished. And it ended up at the end where there was a mass suicide of 900 members of this cult who, for whatever reason, couldn't escape from this group. And one of the driving forces here is the concept of escalation of commitment. And this is the idea that the longer you're in a group, despite all of those increasingly negative outcomes, the more difficult it ends up being to leave the group. So at the beginning, we talked about that love bombing and being surrounded by people who pay attention to you and care about you and all of these things. So it starts out good and then it gradually gets worse and worse and worse. But over time, as you've been more isolated and as this is all you know and the only thing that you're surrounded with, it becomes more and more difficult to leave, which is how so many people probably became trapped in this situation. Another of the cults happened 20 years earlier, and this is this is the Doomsday Cult. And this was run by Marianne Keech. And so this was set up where it was a doomsday cult. They were predicting the end of the world. There were lots and lots of doomsday cults, and there's nothing that made this one particularly famous except for the fact that this cult was well studied and well documented. There were a number of psychological researchers who ended up joining the cult covertly as regular people to make notes and document and investigate what was going on. And so while they were doing this, they picked up lots of information, they documented and analyzed all the actions and interactions, and allowed us to learn a lot about sort of the psychological setup of these things. And so with this cult, they had predicted the end of the world, and they were predicted through the leader's writing. So she would be overcome with these connections to external or even extraterrestrial forces, and would write as though possessed by some external force. And these writings told of the end of the world on this date, at this particular time, and that a spaceship would come and rescue the members, but only if they had fulfilled all of these particular reasons. And of course, that day came and went. They showed up at the location, and nothing happened. So there was some particular interest of how these devout followers ended up responding when they weren't saved by a spaceship and the world was not destroyed. But this was all documented in a book called When Prophecy Fails. So we have a very detailed diary and detailed record of this process that gives us lots and lots of insight as to why this had happened and how people behaved in that particular situation.